GameBoys. I'm lucky enough to own a few of them, and I thought, instead of having them stored away in a drawer somewhere, I should probably display them. I have looked around for some inspiration, and after watching a few YouTube videos, I started really liking the idea of framing them to hang on the wall. My only issue with the ideas I found though was that they were all frames that would need to be disassembled to take the GameBoys out, and I don't know about you, but I'm lazy. And if I have to put that amount of effort to take them out, I'll probably never touch them again. With that in mind, I was at IKEA the other day and I found these Casabit displays which have an actual door at the front. So in this part of the Eric experiment, I'm gonna turn this thing into a cool Game Boy display. So let's go, let's do it, let's just do it.
Use the revolutionary video link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
I've been thinking about this project for ages, and the easiest option for me would have been to go on eBay to buy some Game Boy stands, put them in the Billy bookcases where I store my games and call it a day. The idea of framing the Game Boy sounded really cool though, and also I didn't want to use up space I'd need for games in the future because I don't want to expand my game storage much more, as I want to keep my game collection fairly manageable and space efficient. So building these frames sounded like a fun and logical way to solve this problem. For a while though, because of my requirement of being able to take the Game Boys out easily, I thought I'd have to build or mod some frame with a custom built acrylic or glass door. That was until one day I was at IKEA and I saw the Casabit display and I thought, that's what I need. So I bought one. After getting it home, the first thing I needed to do was to figure out how I would arrange the Game Boys in the display, and that's when I ran into my first hiccup. I could not fit all of the Game Boys together in the frame. I mean, sure, I didn't measure anything before I bought the frame, but it looked big enough given I didn't have too many Game Boys at the time. So I decided to separate the Game Boys into two displays, and to do that, I went back to IKEA and bought a second Casabit. Now I could try to arrange them to see what the best fit would be. This way? Nope. This way. Nah. Definitely not this way. This way. Yeah, this arrangement looks pretty good to me. Now that I knew how they were going to go in, my next challenge was to figure out how I was going to attach them to the frame. My first idea was to use these stainless steel metal wires. I have made some dodgy Game Boy stands with them in the past, but after trying it for a little bit, I realized that would take far too long. My next idea was to use bamboo skewers, but the problem with that was gluing them together. That didn't work at all. Plus, it wouldn't look too good either. Then I thought about using actual acrylic, but cutting it without a laser cutter would be a bit of a nightmare, and getting access to one at this time didn't sound very easy. So after doing a bit of research, I came across these PVC foam boards, which are fairly sturdy and much easier to cut with a knife than acrylic. The first thing I did here was to cut it in half so I could manage it a bit better, and the first holders I built were for the Game Boy colors. My idea was to rest the Game Boys on two arms with some space behind them so I could add some accent lighting. More on that later. I started by kinda sorta drawing the Game Boy color shape onto a piece of paper. My idea here was to fit the Game Boy snugly into the holder so they wouldn't fall off that easily. After I got the basic profile of the Game Boy on the paper, I started drawing the actual arm and spacers around it. I tried to do it with a slight slant so the Game Boys would rest on the spacers behind them and not fall over. After doing that, I cut this with a pair of scissors so I could use it as a template for the foam board. Then I checked it again on the Game Boy to see if the shape was more or less okay, and it seemed fine at this point. The idea here was simple. I would just lay the template down and draw around it. Of course that wasn't gonna be perfect because I was drawing around a piece of paper with a pencil, so after doing that I went around it with a ruler to make some adjustments. Now here came the first difficult part, actually cutting the foam boards, which I did with a knife. Yes, it is a lot easier to cut than acrylic, but it's still pretty hard, especially if you consider how long it took to cut the materials to build 8 holders in total. Another thing I learned here was that you can rub the pencil marks away from the board with your hands very easily. So I had to go over it a couple of times with the template and the ruler again to fix it so I could keep cutting it. This actually caused a couple of issues that I had to fix when it was time to build it later on. My first attempt to avoid this issue was by just scoring the board lightly with a knife after going over the lines with the pencil and the ruler, but ultimately what helped a lot was going straight into the scoring the board with the knife and the ruler instead of using the pencil. That also saved me a bit of time later on. Another little thing I learned the hard way was that cutting curves on this thing is really freaking hard. Oh my god. That was something that I didn't do again for the other Game Boys, so the holders for them ended up being just straight lines. And I regret nothing. So this is the first arm on the Game Boy and it looks okay here, but it did need some adjustments after build. Now I needed to cut the rest of them, and at this point you might be asking, is he going to cut a finger doing this? Yep, he will. Yeah, I had a few other close calls after that one, but no injury would stop me at this point. Game Boy's running my blood. Haha. It's time now to cut the little tabs that will act as the spacers at the back. For this, I just measured the template, used the ruler to draw the lines on the board, and just started cutting. Now I just needed to cut two rectangles slightly smaller than the back of the Game Boys, the height of which I took when I initially drew the template, and I'll use them to keep the whole thing together. After cutting, I just sanded the parts a bit because they weren't perfectly straight. For the other Game Boys, my cut was a bit more precise, so I didn't really need to do this as much. Now it was just a matter of gluing the holders together. Here, like I mentioned before, because of the pencil marks being rubbed away, one of them was a bit crooked. So I needed to do some adjustments, which basically required me to remove the arms, cut them a bit, and glue them back together. And this is what the holder looks like after built. And yeah, that's a camera better that Spielberg here forgot to put away. And these are the holders for the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Pocket, the original Game Boy, and the Game Boy Advance SP. These are actually the first Game Boys I own. I really wanted to have one as a kid, but my parents did not have the means to buy one, so I mostly played on my cousins' or friends' Game Boys. And all I wanted to play was Pokemon. Really. I did like other games like Mario Tennis for the Game Boy Color, for example, but the truth is, as a kid, the only real reason in my mind to buy a Game Boy was to play Pokemon. I saw their games on it as a novelty because, in my opinion, if you wanted to play the actual Mario, Zelda, or whatever game, you should play it on the home console. Then again, I have never been the kind of kid who wanted to play video games when out and about, like on the bus, on the train, or whatever. Even to this day, I'm mostly an indoor player, so if I play my Switch portably, it's probably because I want to play it in bed or on the balcony or something. But with the Game Boy and Pokemon, oh my god, the idea that I could actually battle and trade Pokemon with my friends, that was an awesome concept. God, as a kid I was really into Pokemon. I used to watch the anime, play the card game. Heck, I'm 32 and I'm still into it. I just finished Pokemon Shield on the Switch, but I digress. Now it's time to attach the holders to the frames. I'm putting this little camera here to hold the door so the hinge doesn't bend too far back, as it doesn't look very sturdy, and because I didn't think of doing the obvious thing and unscrewing the door until later on. Dope. So I first laid down the Game Boys into the frame with the holders so I could get the holders themselves in the right position. After doing that, I carefully removed each Game Boy and stuck the holders to the frame using the most foolproof method in the world to prevent them from moving around: sticky tape. And then after that, I started drilling holes so I could attach the holders to the back of the frame with screws and nuts. Now, another hiccup here was the fact that the inside of the displays felt, and making these holes here spread a bunch of plastic debris around, and that was really hard to remove. For the second frame, I made the holes to the holders first, which allowed me to make them a bit more well aligned. Granted, I wasn't too worried about that because they would be hidden behind the Game Boys most of the time. And then after that, I marked the position of the holes with a pen and drilled into the frame separately. I really wish I had done that for the first frame, but oh well. Now it was time to screw these holders in place. I used M3 screws, nuts, and washers for that, and oh my, how I wish I had thought about unscrewing the doors here. And here are the frames with the holders attached. This is cool and all, but you know what's gonna make it look even cooler? Lights. I have this LED strip that I bought from AliExpress a few years ago that I used to use for accent lighting in my entertainment unit before I upgraded to a nicer one from IKEA. I swear this video is not sponsored by IKEA, nor am I part of some sort of weird IKEA cult. The idea here was to glue the LED strips to the inside perimeter of the frames, but I also thought it would be cool to have lights coming from behind of the GameBoys as I mentioned before, hence those little spacers that left a gap from the back of the holders. I first needed to cut the LED strip into multiple shorter sections. So I started by sticking it to the frame so I could cut 2 sections with roughly the same length as the perimeter of the frame. Then I cut 8 sections with 3 LEDs each that went behind the GameBoys for the accent light I mentioned before. Now that I had these sections, I needed to chain them together in a way I could feed the wires through holes and connect them together from the back of the frame. After trying a couple of things, I ended up using those jumper wires for breadboards because they have both male and female ends, which made the chaining of the sections fairly easy. Then after that came hours and hours and hours of stripping wires, organizing them and soldering them onto the strips. So my view of the Game Boy being mostly for Pokemon started to change a bit with the Game Boy Advance. I remember seeing my friends playing Mario Kart Advance at school with the link cable and it was so awesome. Of course I still wanted to play Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, but the games on the Game Boy Advance started looking a bit more like console games from the 16-bit era, which was pretty cool. Sadly I still wasn't able to own one myself at the time though. After doing all of that soldering, it came the time to test it again. I chained them all together, connected them to the driver, connected it to the power, and it worked. That was another hiccup though. The jumper wires added more resistance to the strips that I wanted, and because this strip was only one cathode, the positive wire to feed the red, green, and blue of every single LED, it caused the lights in the letter sections of the strip to be weaker, which kinda sucks because I wanted to use only one driver for both frames. It's kinda hard to see in the video, but it was pretty bad. To solve that without redoing the whole thing, instead of chaining the second strip to the first one, I decided to connect both sections straight to the driver together. So I built this little terminal thing that uses the original connector that came with the strip, and these terminals I can use to screw the wires from both strips to the other side. That improved things a bit, but to make it even better, I cut a couple of USB cables that could handle a bit more amperage and used them to connect the strips to the driver. That was also good because one single black wire connecting both displays looked better than multiple red, green, blue, and white wires. Now it was time to fix the lights to the frames themselves, which was a process that took a few more hours. I first drilled holes to the bottom of the display so the black cables could go through them, and I did that while trying to keep things as clean as possible using the vacuum cleaner. Then I finally thought about removing the doors so they weren't in the way. Better late than never, I guess. After that, I drilled holes that I should have made earlier to pass the wires for the accent lights through. I did a first pass with a Dremel, but those holes weren't wide enough for the wires, so I went with a drill after to expand them a bit. I did that for both frames before fitting the LED strips. Now it was time to do exactly that. I first passed the black cable through the hole on the bottom and stuck it in place with super glue because the hot glue gun wasn't enough for that. And then, this time with the hot glue gun, I started sticking the LED strip to the perimeter of the box. When I was about to finish that, I realized I forgot to drill another hole to pass the wires in the end of the LED strip to the back so I could connect the accent lights to it. A new hole then I drilled. I made sure to do the same to the other display now while I had the drill in hand. Now I just had to pass those wires through so I could start sticking the accent lights in place. Since there wasn't too much space and each strip had only 3 LEDs, I folded them before passing the wires through to the back and using the hot glue gun and glued them in place. I just had to test this whole thing again now, so I connected all of the wires at the back together. Some of them were pretty far apart, so it was a bit of a stretch. And then after that, I connected the display to the driver and bam! It worked! After all of that, I screwed the door back in place and I repeated the whole process for the second display, which was going to be the bottom one with the driver. So I used both the hot glue gun and the super glue when the hot glue gun didn't cut it to attach the driver and the other components to the bottom. They shouldn't be visible because the doors overhang a bit, so I didn't worry too much about them being exposed. After that, I connected the wires to the terminal so I could test this one as well before screwing the door back in place.
Escape to a world of color for each and every Game Boy game. New Game Boy Color.
And there you have it. I think this project turned out pretty great. And the best part about it is that I can very easily open the displays up to take the Game Boys out if I want. Now, as I briefly mentioned earlier, I might revisit this project again in the future when I have access to a laser cutter, because I think the displays would look even better if the holders were made of transparent acrylic, and also if I could cut some acrylic diffusers to put over the LED strips. Also, whoops, I bought a few more Game Boys, so I guess I'll have to build more displays. But other than that, this looks great for now given the constraints we have, you know, in the world. And that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe to get notified when more comes out. Thanks for watching.